August 1945. The morning sun breaks over the shattered landscape of Tokyo, casting long shadows across rubble that was once a thriving residential district. In the skeletal remains of what had been a textile factory, a group of women gather, silent, exhausted, their hands calloused from years of wartime labor. They have survived the firebombings, the starvation rations, the endless propaganda broadcasts promising final victory. Now, in the suffocating heat of late summer, they wait. The war is over. The Americans are coming. In the mind of Mrs. Fumiko Hayashi, a 42-year-old widow whose husband fell at Guadalcanal, there exists only one certainty: the invaders will be monsters. For 4 years, the imperial government has prepared the civilian population for this moment. The enemy soldiers, they were told, are beasts without honor, men who will defile, destroy, and desecrate everything sacred in Japanese culture. Fumiko has sewn a small knife into the lining of her jacket. She has made her decision. She will not be taken alive. She does not know that within weeks her entire understanding of the world will collapse, not through violence, but through the unexpected softness of a pillow. The expectation of brutality was not born from paranoia alone. It emerged from a carefully constructed narrative, one that the Japanese imperial government had spent years building into the consciousness of its people. From 1941 onward, as the Pacific War intensified, Japanese civilians were subjected to an unrelenting stream of propaganda designed to prepare them for invasion. Newspapers printed lurid accounts of American atrocities, fabricated stories of mass rapes in occupied territories, of civilians burned alive, of children torn from their mothers' arms. Radio broadcasts repeated these themes daily, often multiple times per hour. The message was clear and consistent. The Americans were not merely enemies. They were inhuman, savage, beyond the pale of civilization. This propaganda found fertile ground in a culture already steeped in notions of honor, sacrifice, and collective identity. The concept of gyokusai, shattering like a jewel, had been elevated to the highest virtue. To die in defense of the emperor and the homeland was glorious. To surrender was unthinkable shame. Women, particularly, were instructed in their duties should invasion come. They were to resist with bamboo spears if necessary, to throw themselves and their children from cliffs rather than face capture, to choose death over dishonor. On Saipan in July 1944, over 1,000 Japanese civilians had leapt from the cliffs at Marpi Point rather than surrender to American forces. The Japanese government held this up as the ultimate expression of loyalty and purity. In this context, the women of Tokyo in August 1945 were not simply afraid, they were resigned to martyrdom. They had been conditioned, psychologically and culturally, to view the coming occupation as an apocalypse from which death was the only honorable escape. The government distributed cyanide capsules to some civilians. Schools drilled children in suicide tactics. The entire nation braced for annihilation. And then the Americans arrived. September 2, 1945. General Douglas MacArthur accepts Japan's formal surrender aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. Within days, American occupation forces begin landing throughout the Japanese home islands. They come not as the ravaging horde of propaganda, but as organized military units with strict orders: respect the civilian population, maintain order, distribute food, and begin the process of reconstruction. The contrast between expectation and reality is so stark that many Japanese civilians simply cannot process it. Fumiko Hayashi first encounters American soldiers on September 8, a week after the surrender. A convoy of trucks rolls through her neighborhood, and she watches from a doorway, her hand on the concealed knife, her breath shallow. The trucks stop. Soldiers dismount. Tall, impossibly well-fed men in crisp uniforms. They begin unloading crates. Within minutes, a field kitchen is established. The smell of cooking food, real food, not the acorn flour and sawdust bread that has sustained Tokyo for months, drifts through the shattered streets. The soldiers begin distributing rations to the gathering crowd. No shots are fired. No homes are entered. No women are seized. Instead, a young American soldier, perhaps 20 years old, with red hair and a sunburned face, hands Fumiko a wrapped package and smiles. He says something in English she cannot understand, but his tone is gentle, almost apologetic. She takes the package with trembling hands and retreats. That night, alone in the corner of a bombed-out building she now calls home, Fumiko unwraps the package. Inside, canned meat, chocolate bars, a package of cigarettes, and, most bewildering of all, a small rectangular object wrapped in cotton fabric. She unfolds the fabric carefully. It is a pillowcase, and inside it, a pillow. Not the hard rice husk-filled blocks she has known all her life, but something impossibly soft, yielding, filled with what feels like clouds. She presses her face against it. The fabric is smooth, finer than anything she has touched in years. The pillow gives beneath the pressure of her cheek, conforming to the shape of her head, offering a comfort so alien that tears begin to stream down her face. She cannot name what she is feeling. It is not quite relief, not quite grief, but something between them, something that feels like the world turning inside out. For the first time in 4 years, Fumiko Hayashi allows herself to wonder if everything she has been told might be a lie. The American pillow, this mundane object, mass-produced in some factory in Indiana or Ohio or California, becomes an unintentional ambassador of a different world. In the weeks and months following the occupation, similar scenes play out across Japan. American forces distribute not only food and medicine, but also bedding, clothing, and other supplies. For Japanese women, particularly those who have spent years sleeping on thin mats laid over hard wooden floors, who have known only the austerity and deprivation of total war, these items represent something more than mere comfort. They represent abundance on a scale that seems impossible. The contrast is fundamental and profound. Japanese wartime society had been organized around the principle of scarcity. Every resource was rationed, every luxury eliminated, every individual expected to sacrifice for the collective good. Rice rations had shrunk to starvation levels. The average civilian in Tokyo by mid-1945 was subsisting on less than 1,500 calories per day, often consuming sawdust-mixed bread and sweet potato vines. Clothing was patched and repatched until it disintegrated. Housing was overcrowded and primitive. The entire population had been told, repeatedly, that this suffering was necessary, that the enemy too was suffering, that victory would come through superior spirit and endurance. And then the enemy arrived, and they brought pillows. The psychological impact of this disconnect cannot be overstated. Mrs. Keiko Nakamura, a schoolteacher from Yokohama, recorded her impressions in a diary that would later be preserved in the National Archives. On September 15, 1945, she wrote, "The American soldiers gave us blankets today. Real wool blankets, thick and warm. I have not seen such things since before the war. My daughter asked me why the Americans have so much if they are supposed to be losing. I had no answer for her. I have been teaching her for years that America is weak, decadent, on the verge of collapse. But these men do not look weak. They do not look like they are losing anything. They look healthy and strong, and they have more than we could dream of. What have we been told? What have I been teaching?" The pillow becomes, in this context, a symbol of systemic difference, not merely between abundance and scarcity, but between two fundamentally different ways of organizing society and valuing human life. In Imperial Japan, the individual was subsumed into the collective. Personal comfort was not merely unimportant, it was suspect, possibly treasonous. The government had spent years conditioning the population to view hardship as virtue, suffering as purification. To desire comfort was to be weak, unworthy, un-Japanese. But here was the enemy, the supposedly weak, decadent enemy, providing comfort freely, without expectation of reciprocity, to a defeated population that had been taught to hate them. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. By October 1945, the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, Douglas MacArthur, has established his headquarters in the Daiichi Life Insurance Building in Tokyo. The occupation is proceeding with surprising smoothness. Expected widespread resistance has not materialized. Instead, American forces report a population that is compliant, curious, and increasingly cooperative. The distribution of food aid intensifies. The U.S. military brings in millions of tons of supplies: rice, wheat, canned goods, milk powder, medical supplies. Starvation, which had seemed inevitable in the immediate post-war period, is averted. For Japanese women, who have borne the brunt of wartime deprivation, who have watched their children grow thin and hollow-eyed, this American abundance is a revelation that cuts deeper than any propaganda could reach. The soft pillow is part of a larger picture. The soldiers who share their rations, who play with Japanese children instead of bayoneting them, who help clear rubble, who treat the defeated enemy with a casual generosity that seems to come naturally. Fumiko Hayashi begins working as a laundress for the American occupation forces in late October. The job provides desperately needed income. Her husband's military pension died with the empire, and she has a 13-year-old son to feed. She is assigned to a facility where she washes and mends uniforms, bedding, and other textiles. It is here that she encounters American pillows in quantity, dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, all identical, all impossibly soft. One day, a young American officer notices her examining a pillowcase with evident curiosity. Through a translator, he explains that these are standard military issue, that every American soldier is provided with such bedding, that this is normal, expected, the minimum standard of comfort that American society provides even to its soldiers in the field. Fumiko listens, and something inside her shifts. She thinks of her husband, who slept on the ground in the jungles of the South Pacific, who wrote letters home describing mud and dysentery and hunger, who died, according to the official notice, honorably in service to the emperor. She thinks of the teenage boys she saw marching off to war in the final desperate months, boys barely older than her son, given rifles and told to die for Japan. And she thinks, we were told they were weak. We were told we were strong. We were told our spirit would triumph over their materialism. But they have won, and they have pillows, and our boys died in the mud. The translator, a Japanese-American soldier from California named Henry Takahashi, notices the expression on her face. He has seen it before on countless Japanese civilians, the moment when the propaganda dissolves, when reality intrudes, when the carefully constructed narrative collapses. He does not say anything. There is nothing to say. The pillow has already spoken more eloquently than any words could. The transformation in perception that occurs across occupied Japan between late 1945 and 1946 is one of the most dramatic ideological shifts in modern history. A population that had been indoctrinated for years, in some cases for a generation, into a worldview that positioned Imperial Japan as the righteous center of civilization and America as a degenerate enemy, now had to reconcile that worldview with direct, lived experience that contradicted it at every turn. The soft pillow is part of this reconciliation, but it is not alone. American occupation forces introduce a flood of small, everyday evidences of a different kind of society. Japanese women working in occupation facilities are paid fair wages, often more than they could earn in the devastated Japanese economy. They are treated, generally speaking, with respect. They are not expected to bow, to abase themselves, to demonstrate subservience. The Americans are informal, sometimes disconcertingly so, addressing Japanese workers with a casualness that violates every hierarchical norm of Japanese culture, but which also carries an implicit message. You are not inferior, you are not conquered slaves, you are simply people. This message is reinforced materially, constantly. The PX stores that spring up on American bases are wonderland glimpses into a different world, shelves stocked with goods that seem impossibly luxurious. Cosmetics, toiletries, canned fruit, chocolate, coffee, soap that actually lathers. Japanese workers are sometimes allowed to purchase items at these stores, and what they buy they bring home, and word spreads. The Americans have everything. Not just the soldiers, but, they claim, ordinary people back in America. Farmers have tractors. Workers have cars. Every home has electricity, running water, soft beds. It seems like fantasy. It seems like propaganda in reverse. But the evidence keeps accumulating. The soldiers show photographs of their homes, their families. They are not aristocrats or elites. They are ordinary men, sons of shopkeepers and farmers and factory workers, and yet they come from a world of abundance that makes pre-war Japan look impoverished by comparison. Mrs. Aiko Tanaka, a widow from Osaka, finds work in a mess hall serving American officers. In her diary, dated January 1946, she writes, "Today I served breakfast to 30 men. The amount of food wasted would have fed my family for a week. Eggs, bacon, bread with butter, real butter, fresh milk, coffee. Some of the men barely touch their plates, and the leftovers are simply thrown away. I wanted to cry. I wanted to scream. How did we think we could defeat such a nation? How did we think we could win when they have so much that they throw away more than we have to eat? We were told they were starving, that our submarines were cutting off their supplies, that they were on the verge of collapse. But these men are fat, not all of them, but many, and none of them look like they have missed a single meal. We starved for the emperor. Our children starved. And it was all for nothing." The pillow, in this context, becomes more than an object. It becomes a metaphor, a tangible symbol of the gulf between two worlds, two systems, two philosophies of what human life should be. In Imperial Japan, the ideal citizen was one who could endure suffering without complaint, who could subsist on rice and pickles, who could sleep on hard floors and wake ready to sacrifice. Comfort was decadence. Luxury was corruption. The hard pillow, if one had a pillow at all, was a point of pride, a demonstration of discipline and toughness. But the Americans, who had won the war, who had traveled halfway across the world to fight, who had destroyed the imperial military and occupied the home islands, these Americans valued comfort. They insisted on it, considered it a right, built it into their military supply chains. And they had won. The lesson was inescapable. Hardship was not virtue. Suffering did not lead to victory. The Americans had defeated Japan not through superior spirit, but through superior resources, superior organization, superior technology. And yes, through a social system that produced such abundance that even common soldiers could have soft pillows. By the spring of 1946, the initial shock of occupation has given way to something more complex. Japanese society is beginning to reorganize itself under American guidance. The Zaibatsu conglomerates are being broken up. Land reform is underway. Women are granted suffrage, a right they had never possessed under the imperial system. The new constitution, drafted largely by American lawyers but promulgated as Japanese, enshrines principles of democracy, individual rights, and pacifism. For many Japanese women, particularly those of the older generation, this period is profoundly disorienting. Everything they were taught, everything they believed, has been inverted. The emperor, who was divine, has renounced his divinity. The military, which was sacred, has been disbanded and its leaders tried as war criminals. The values that define Japanese identity, hierarchy, obedience, collective sacrifice, are being replaced with American concepts, equality, liberty, individual happiness. And through it all, in countless small ways, the material evidence of American abundance continues to accumulate. The soft pillow that Fumiko Hayashi received in September 1945 is still with her in April 1946. It has become one of her most treasured possessions. She washes the pillowcase carefully, dries it in the sun, protects it from the damp. At night, when she lays her head on it, she feels something she has not felt in years. The possibility that life might be more than endurance, that comfort might be legitimate, that perhaps the individual human body deserves gentleness. Her son, Takashi, now 14, has begun attending a school reopened under American supervision. He is learning English. He is reading books that were forbidden during the war, books about democracy, about science, about the wider world. He comes home excited, talking about America, about the things he wants to see, the life he wants to live. Fumiko listens, and a part of her recoils. This is her son, her Japanese son, becoming seduced by the enemy's values. But another part of her, the part that touches the soft pillow each night, wonders if perhaps this is not seduction but liberation. The American occupation authorities, for their strategic purposes, are acutely aware of the importance of winning hearts and minds. The policy, directed from Washington and implemented by MacArthur's administration, is not merely to defeat Japan militarily but to transform it ideologically. The distribution of material aid is part of this strategy. Every meal provided, every blanket distributed, every act of casual generosity is intended to demonstrate that American power is not merely destructive but constructive, not merely punitive but benevolent. The soft pillow, in this sense, is an instrument of policy, though likely no American strategist ever explicitly thought of it in those terms. It is part of a vast, complex effort to reshape Japanese consciousness, to replace the values of the imperial system with the values of liberal democracy and consumer capitalism. The message, delivered through 1,000 small kindnesses and material comforts, is this: life does not have to be suffering. Prosperity is possible. Individual happiness is legitimate. And the American way, democracy, capitalism, consumerism, is the path to that prosperity. For Japanese women, this message carries particular resonance. In the imperial system, women's roles were strictly defined and subordinated. A woman existed to serve her father, her husband, her sons, the emperor. Her own desires, her own comfort, her own aspirations were secondary at best, illegitimate at worst. The ideal Japanese woman was selfless, enduring, silent. But here are the American soldiers, treating Japanese women as workers worthy of fair wages, as human beings deserving of basic respect. Here are the occupation authorities, granting women the right to vote, encouraging their education, opening opportunities previously unimaginable. And here, most tangibly, is the soft pillow, an acknowledgement that even a woman's sleep, her rest, her physical comfort, matters. The transformation is not universal, nor is it unopposed. Many Japanese, particularly men of the older generation, view these changes with horror. They see the soft pillows, the Western clothing, the casual manners, the democratic reforms as a kind of cultural death, a betrayal of everything that made Japan distinct and honorable. There are those who cling to the old values, who insist that the war was just, that the surrender was a mistake, that Japan's soul is being corrupted by American materialism. But among the women, particularly those who lived through the worst of the war years, there is less nostalgia for the imperial era. They remember the hunger, the fear, the endless litany of sacrifice demanded and taken. They remember the hard floors and the harder choices. And when they compare those memories to the present reality, the soft pillow, the full rice bowl, the children who are no longer starving, the comparison is not subtle. Mrs. Haruko Sato, a farmer's widow from the countryside outside Hiroshima, travels to the city in May 1946 to visit a cousin who works for the occupation forces. The cousin gives her a care package to take home: canned milk, chocolate bars, soap, and a pillow. Haruko travels back to her village with the pillow wrapped in cloth, carried carefully, as if it were something sacred. In her village, which was far enough from Hiroshima to escape the atomic bomb but close enough to have seen the flash and the cloud, she shows the pillow to her neighbors. They gather in her small home, these women who have survived the war, and they pass the pillow around, touching it, marveling at its softness. One woman, elderly, begins to weep. She does not explain why, but the others understand. It is not just a pillow. It is evidence of a world they were never allowed to imagine, a world where ordinary people might have such things, where comfort was not rationed and controlled, where life could be gentle. That night, Haruko writes a letter to her cousin in Hiroshima. In it, she says, "Thank you for the pillow. I have been thinking about what it means. For all my life, I was taught that to be Japanese was to endure, to accept hardship, to never complain. I was proud of this. I thought it made us strong. But now I wonder if it was not strength but a kind of prison. The Americans have so much, and they do not seem weaker for it. They do not seem less honorable. They simply seem comfortable, and they seem to believe that comfort is something all people deserve. I do not know if this is true. I do not know if we should become like them. But I am tired, cousin. I am so tired. And when I sleep on this soft pillow, I feel something I have not felt in years. I feel like perhaps I am allowed to rest." By late 1946, the occupation has settled into a routine. Japan's economy, though still devastated, is beginning to stabilize. The food crisis has eased. Reconstruction is underway. The most dramatic political reforms have been implemented. The Japanese people are adjusting to their new reality, and for many, that reality includes small comforts that would have been unimaginable during the war years. The soft pillow, which once seemed like an impossible luxury, has become less extraordinary. Some Japanese manufacturers, retooling their factories with American aid and guidance, have begun producing similar items for domestic consumption. The occupation authorities encourage this. Part of rebuilding Japan's economy involves creating a consumer market, teaching the Japanese population to desire and purchase goods, to participate in the kind of consumer capitalism that defines American prosperity. But for those who remember, for the women like Fumiko and Keiko and Aiko and Haruko who first encountered American abundance in the rubble of defeat, the soft pillow retains its symbolic power. It marks a dividing line in their lives, a before and after, a boundary between two worlds. Fumiko Hayashi, still working as a laundress for the occupation forces, has saved enough money by December 1946 to rent a small apartment. Not much, just 2 rooms, but intact, with a roof that doesn't leak and floors that are level. She brings with her almost nothing. The war took everything, but she has the pillow. She places it carefully on the thin mattress she has purchased, and that night she sleeps better than she has in years. In her dreams, she sees her husband. He is young again, as he was when they married, before the war, before the propaganda, before the empire demanded everything and gave back only grief. He looks at her with sadness and says nothing. She wakes with tears on her face, but they are not only tears of sorrow. They are tears of release, of a burden finally beginning to lift. She thinks, "I survived. I survived the war, I survived the firebombings, I survived the occupation I was taught to fear more than death. And now I have a soft pillow, and my son is learning English, and perhaps we will be all right." The occupation will continue until 1952. By then, Japan will be well on its way to the economic miracle that will transform it into one of the world's most prosperous nations. The soft pillows will be ubiquitous, manufactured locally, sold in department stores, utterly ordinary. The generation that first encountered them as gifts from the occupying enemy will age, their memories softening like the pillows themselves, the sharp edges of trauma gradually, imperfectly healing. But in the early years, in that liminal period between defeat and reconstruction, the pillow meant something more. It was a challenge to everything they had been taught, a material argument against the ideology that had shaped their lives and cost them so much. It suggested, in its simple softness, that the values they had been raised with, endurance, austerity, the subordination of individual comfort to collective purpose, were not universal truths but choices, and that other choices were possible. In the end, the shock of the soft American pillow was not merely about comfort. It was about the sudden, disorienting realization that they had been lied to systematically and comprehensively, about the nature of the world and their place in it. They had been told that Americans were weak, decadent, inferior. They had been told that Japanese superiority lay in spiritual strength, in the ability to endure what others could not. They had been told that their suffering had meaning, had purpose, would lead to victory. And then the Americans arrived with their soft pillows, their full stomachs, their casual generosity, and none of it was true. The transformation that followed, political, economic, social, psychological, was built on a foundation of countless small moments like these, moments when the gap between propaganda and reality became too wide to ignore, when the evidence of one's own senses overwhelmed the narratives that had structured belief. The soft pillow did not change Japan by itself, but it was part of a larger pattern, a constellation of experiences that collectively rewrote the consciousness of a nation. By the 1950s, a new generation would come of age in Japan, a generation that would never know the empire, that would take soft pillows for granted, that would embrace democracy and capitalism and consumer culture without the guilt and confusion of their parents. They would be the children of the occupation, shaped by American values as much as Japanese traditions, and they would build a Japan that was prosperous, peaceful, and profoundly different from the one that had marched to war. But for the women who remembered the hard floors and the hunger and the fear, who remembered the moment when an American soldier handed them a soft pillow and their world turned inside out, the transformation was never entirely complete. They carried both worlds inside them, the before and the after, and in the tension between those worlds lived all the complexity of history, all the weight of change, all the pain and possibility of becoming something new. Fumiko Hayashi lived until 1983. Her son, Takashi, became an engineer, worked for Sony, traveled to America many times for business. He married, had children, prospered in the Japan that rose from the ashes. Fumiko watched this with pride and with a sadness she could never fully articulate. She kept the pillow until it finally disintegrated, the fabric wearing through, the filling compressing into uselessness. When it was beyond repair, she wrapped it in paper and placed it carefully in the trash, and she felt as if she were burying something. Not just an object, but a piece of her history, a fragment of the moment when everything changed. In her final years, when her grandchildren visited, they sometimes asked her about the war. She did not like to speak of it. The memories were too complicated, too painful, touched too many nerves that had never fully healed. But sometimes, if pressed, she would tell them about the pillow, about how soft it was, how impossible it seemed, how it made her question everything she thought she knew. And her grandchildren, who slept on foam mattresses and synthetic fiber pillows manufactured in Japanese factories and exported around the world, who had never known hunger or fear or the weight of propaganda's iron certainty, would listen politely and not really understand. To them, a soft pillow was normal, expected, barely worth noticing. They could not imagine a world where such a thing could be revolutionary. But Fumiko remembered. She remembered the hardness of the floor, the ache in her bones, the exhaustion that went beyond physical tiredness into something spiritual, a weariness of being. She remembered the knife she had sewn into her jacket, the resignation to death that had seemed like courage. And she remembered the first night she laid her head on that impossibly soft pillow, and how it had felt like a question being asked, a question she spent the rest of her life trying to answer. What does it mean to live well? What do we owe to ourselves, beyond duty, beyond sacrifice? Is comfort a weakness, or is the denial of comfort a kind of violence? Can a nation, a culture, a people transform themselves without losing everything that made them who they were? The pillow could not answer these questions. It was just an object, cotton and fabric, stitched together in a factory by workers who never imagined it would carry such weight. But it asked the questions nonetheless, asked them in a language more fundamental than words, the language of the body, of rest, of the simple human need for gentleness in a world that had been hard for far too long. And in asking those questions, in the space between what was expected and what was received, between what they were told and what they experienced, the women of occupied Japan found room to change, to grow, to become something other than what history had prescribed. They found room to imagine different futures, different possibilities, different ways of being human. The soft American pillow, in the end, was not just about comfort. It was about freedom, the freedom to rest, to desire, to question, to choose. It was about the possibility that life could be more than endurance, that peace could be more than the absence of war, that victory could wear an unexpected face and speak in a language of kindness rather than conquest. And for the women who lived through that transformation, who held in their hands both the memory of what was and the reality of what became, the pillow remained a symbol of the most profound truth they learned in those years, that the world is larger than any ideology, any propaganda, any certainty. That reality, in the end, is more powerful than belief. And that sometimes salvation comes not as we expect it, not in glory or vindication or the triumph of spirit, but in small, soft, utterly ordinary acts of grace. The sun sets over Tokyo, and in 10,000 homes, women lay their heads on soft pillows and drift toward sleep. They do not think about history. They do not remember the war. For them, this is simply life, normal and unremarkable. But the pillows remember. They carry in their fibers the story of a nation transformed, of certainties shattered and rebuilt, of the long, difficult path from hardness to softness, from war to peace, from the lies we tell ourselves to the truths we cannot escape. And in that story, soft and quiet as a pillow's whisper, lies a lesson, that comfort is not weakness, that abundance is not decadence, that the simple human desire for gentleness and rest is not something to be ashamed of but something to be honored. That we do not have to be hard to be strong, do not have to suffer to have meaning, do not have to endure without question or complaint. We can lay our heads down softly. We can rest. We can allow ourselves to be cared for. And in that allowing, in that simple acceptance of comfort, we can find not the weakness we were warned against, but a strength we never knew existed, the strength to change, to grow, to become something better than we were. The pillow is soft. The world is hard. And between these two truths, we make our lives, our choices, our history. This is what the women of occupied Japan learned. This is what the soft American pillow taught them. And this is what endures, long after the war has faded into memory and the pillows themselves have turned to dust, the knowledge that we are allowed to be gentle with ourselves, that comfort has value, that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply to rest.